the chastened Akrani soldiers, very conscious of their dishonour in retreating from the affray, vented their spleen by giving the Gathkari in the stocks a good beating with their fists. But they declined to pursue the murderous Westerner and his siren temptress. For the second time in a week, Ealdred and Ig had killed honoured guests, transgressing the law and storing up even more cause to leave this defeated country as soon as possible. But in the middle of so much indolent anarchy and idle pandemonium, it seemed likely that their small contribution to the general turmoil would pass unnoticed. They hurried on to the docks, but there only disappointment awaited them. The sooner they sailed for Longalay, the better they both would like it, and a sail might have been had for the asking in other circumstances. But not today. There was a 3-mast ship and a dozen fair-sized boats tied up at the quays, bobbing on the tide, alongside a small flotilla of fishing sloops. All of them were burning fiercely. The ship and every last boat in the little fleet of the harbour of Fari had been torched for fun or devilment, and they would blaze until they had sunk so far into the sea that the water doused the fire. A rabble of arsonists and their supporters were making merry on the dockside, toasting their own valour as the huge sails of the ship were enveloped in sheets of crackling flame, and the smaller vessels burnt like tinder. There was nothing else for it. Ealdred and Ig must take up the road again and travel further south, placing their hopes on Porta Aberta. If things were as bad there, the Anglian would have no choice but to abandon his plan to sail to the barony and reverse his horse's steps back to Piccoli and the chance of a mad dash across Bourbon. For the only other craft on these waters on which he might buy passage over the ditch were the tiny flat-hull rafts used by the rod and line fishermen, and they would obviously not be large enough to accommodate Hengustir on board. A more substantial craft was needed, and if he did not find it in Porta Aberta, he would find it nowhere. He cursed this surrendered nation of priestesses and madmen, who laid themselves in humility at the feet of any foreigner who wished to spurn them like a cur with his heel. Back in the days of the Gathkar Republic, the great harbour on their western seaboard had been known as Chave na Porta, which meant the key in the door. But after the Revolution, the rulers of the queendoms had renamed it Porta Aberta, which meant the open door, and it had lived up to its new name, exceedingly to its detriment. Once a major maritime city, it was now so totally overrun with presumptuous Akrani that it could more properly be considered a colony of Imperial Akran, as a portion of the dominion of Sultan Aziz Faisal, whose soldiers continued to move casually north, up through the southern regions of the queendoms, without a blow ever being struck in the defence of once proud Gathkar. Ealdred had bought 2 andar kapas, cloaks for riding, during their progress down the coast, making sure not to buy them in the Gathkari style, but in the more popular Telitzim fashion. He did not want to be mistaken for a Gathkari. Wrapped in these, he and Ig made their still less than inconspicuous way toward the harbour. Around them the city was awash with crimson and yellow ochre, due to the vast number of Akrani military who were in residence. So large a martial force had no legitimate business in Porta Aberta, but who amongst the government officials would challenge their right to be there? Sultan Aziz Faisal, their liege lord, frequently sent regiments and even brigades of his troops on manoeuvres in Gathkar, treating the territory as already being little more than an extension of his own realm, ripe for usurpation. Even the Gathkari ruling caste in Porta Aberta had been unable to shield their hypocrites' eyes from the reality of the situation outside their temple walls. Unrest and disorder were everywhere in the streets, as looting and pillaging went unpunished. The city tottered on the brink of riot. Accordingly, the high priestesses had determined to take the firmest and most resolute measures to quell the growing anarchy. They had called a conclave of the entire coven of priestesses, all 333 of them, to sing to the goddess for salvation. They would perform the enchantment of livramenta utero, the womb deliverance, to beg Artemis for a cessation of conflict, the end of masculine aggression, and a restoration of maternal harmony in hallowed feminine wisdom. Presiding over this mystic hexcraft, the high priestesses of the temple sat enthroned in the enormous chamber called the Palace of Love and Adoration. At one side of this devotional hall, the elders amongst the priestesses played flutes and struck drums and shook bells. Around the other three walls the sisters stood and chanted, singing their mantras and incantations in the charm of conjuring, whilst across the floor the young novices danced, skipping and leaping in a ballet that had been choreographed to emphasize the physicality of the female. They rolled their breasts and revolved their backsides and pumped their hips forward in appeal to the goddess to acknowledge their gender kinship with her. They swooped and spun around, their pink gossamer veils trailing out behind them, as they fluttered their arms and perched on tiptoe and bowed before Artemis, evoking the magic of the livramento utero, so that the milky fruit of the sacred sorcery would come. All day and all night and into the next day they played their music and sang their incantations and danced their adoration in the devout belief that no violence of the male temperament could possibly withstand the pure ascendancy of moral womanhood under the lunar divinity of the many-breasted and the unassailable rectitude of Mawanamamaku, the supreme woman. At the time when Ealdred and Ige arrived in the city, the temple coven of Porta Aberta had been praying and performing their rite of womb deliverance continuously for 36 hours. Every hour on the hour, a humble male functionary appeared at the doorway of the outer temple to announce to an oblivious citizenry that the entreaties of the faithful were raised to the most holy on their behalf, whereupon he would appeal for public calm and beg for a restoration of the rule of law. This benign conjurement of the Matriarchs was the only succour to which the citizens of the harbour city might look for their relief. In the incident, subsequently referred to by the Gathkaris as the tragedy of the denunciation and censure of souls, it was this lowly functionary making the announcement at the door of the outer temple who was the first to die. The triangular edifice of the Temple of Artemis was the tallest, broadest, and most impressive building in the city, as was only right and proper. This four-sided pyramid, square at its base, was built of slabs of stone that took 4 men to haul into place with rope and tackle. Its architecture facilitated a series of chambers on different levels inside the building, so that as a woman moved inward toward the center, she also climbed up from the lower to the higher levels. This reflected the hierarchy of Mawanamamaku. The top and most central level was the vast Palace of Love and Adoration, where the goddess herself was reverenced in supplication. One level down was the softly echoing Chamber of Solicitude, where all 333 priestesses lived and loved in peaceful and obedient communion. A single long dormitory entirely surrounded the Chamber of Solicitude that was encircled within it, with numerous entrances on all 4 sides. These 2 levels combined constituted the inner temple, consecrated to the female and never to be despoiled by the presence of the male. Lower than that was the outer temple, which was mostly given over to the Chamber of Preparations, where the male acolytes worked at all the domestic services that were needful, not least keeping the fires of the boilers steaming in order to heat the stone chambers above, where the priestesses performed their ceremonials effectively nude. The boilers provided an underfloor source of heating that kept the chambers of the inner temple overhead at a very comfortable temperature, even for those who wore no garment but the priestess's veil. Although the sweltering boiler room itself was like the very living inferno of hell for the sweat-drenched and skeletal men who toiled there.